There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised.
It's about 2 p.m. on a crisp Wednesday afternoon in August 2011. An 18-year-old Madeleine Pulver is in her family's 3-storey waterfront mansion in the glitzy Sydney suburb of Mosman. She's studying for her HSC trials, the practice run before the final exams for Year 12s in the state of New South Wales. The house is quiet today. Her 2 younger brothers are at school and her older brother is away. Her dad, Bill, head of a multi-million-dollar global software company, is in his city office, and her mum, Belinda, is out consulting with her landscape gardening company. Madeleine's home alone. Suddenly, the silence is broken by a man wearing a rainbow ski mask carrying a baseball bat who bursts into the room. "Sit down, and no one needs to get hurt," he tells her. The masked man pulls out a black box that's being held up by what looks like a bike chain that he fastens around her throat. After locking it, he places a lanyard holding a USB stick and 2 pages of demands around her neck. Then he walks away, but not before he tells a terrified Madeleine to count to 200. "I'll be back," he warns. "If you move, I can see you. I'll be right here."
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is about the Mosman collar bomb that made international headlines in 2011. My guests today, between them, have more than 50 years' experience reporting on Sydney's crime scene. The Daily Telegraph's crime editor Mark Morey and former 2GB court reporter Gil Taylor. So Gil, help me paint a picture here. We both live in Greater Sydney. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the suburb or the area of Mosman?
Well, it's a very affluent suburb. I'd say the average income is higher than most, without pigeonholing people or anything like that. And the Pulver family resided there. Bill and Belinda had 4 children. Bill was from a prominent rugby school, Shaw, graduated there in the late 70s, and he's probably still to this day a prominent sports administrator and a multi-property owner. So a self-made man, I guess.
Yeah, the Pulver family were quite well known in their local community. Both the parents had high-flying jobs. I was reading some articles that said that Madeleine's dad was, one of the richest men in Australia at the time, which doesn't surprise me, given that the area is, to give people an idea if they're not from Sydney, it's like a few suburbs down from the Prime Minister's residence in Sydney.
Yeah, well, he ended up being CEO of Rugby Australia. That, I believe, was after the incident.
Oh, okay.
I think it was 2013 or something like that. He took over from John O'Neill. Obviously, that's a very high-paid job, a very stressful one, and a huge responsibility. But obviously a very competent businessman, and Belinda in her own right, of course. So, yeah, as you say, a very wealthy family and self-made, and everything was going well up until that day at least.
What was Madeleine doing on the afternoon of August 3?
She was just studying for the HSC. She was in her bedroom. Paul Peters had broken into the home. He approached her in her bedroom. She turned and saw him. I can't imagine what was going through her mind at that point, but he was carrying a baseball bat and had a multi-coloured balaclava on.
That detail about the balaclava, that was really strange, wasn't it?
For a long time, we just believed it was a balaclava, and it took quite a while before it came out that this balaclava was multicoloured. And I remember we went and bought one exactly the same as was described in the court documents, and it's terrifying. I mean, a black balaclava is scary enough, but this one was multicoloured, and you could imagine Maddie just for years would have had nightmares. It had made it more frightening than just a plain balaclava.
And terrifying when you think you're alone.
And terrifying. Your house seemingly secure, And without going into it too much, a suburb like Mosman, whatever the house was worth, it would have had security, various things. And suddenly he's there and he fastens a box-like device around her neck. She kept asking what he wanted, and he told her to count to 200, and then he left. He also put a USB thumb drive, and a plastic sleeve was also attached to the lanyard, which held a 2-page document outlining the extortion demands and instructions. So a horrifying experience. Now, she obviously thought, well, he could still be in the house. What do I do? I don't know what to do. And she read the note, and I think I remember part of the case in the facts where she read the word explosive in relation to what was around her neck. So naturally, from that point on, she believed that it could potentially explode at any time. And as she's reading the note, it actually also told her not to contact authorities or anyone. By that time, she'd already texted her parents, rung her father, Bill, and told him to call the police. Of course, she had no idea what was going to be in the note when she started reading it, and her first impulse was to call people, as you would.
Of course.
So that would have only amplified the fear, thinking, I've already done something that the extortion note tells me not to do, so now what do I do?
2 pages is a lot of extortion demands. Did it say anything else? Did it give her any other instructions apart from don't call the cops? Like, what was he trying to do?
Well, it didn't have an exact amount of money, but funds must be deposited. It also claimed that the box around her neck was designed by a Green Beret. Now, a Green Beret is a military soldier. It is a specific position or a specific sort of training that you have to become a Green Beret. They're experts in survival and things like that. Now, that gives her the impression, even if she doesn't know what a Green Beret is, it gives you the impression that this is a really highly sophisticated person, ability-wise at least, that has constructed this thing, and that they are the only ones that can stop this device from being activated. All sorts of things would have been going through her head, like, are they going to be able to disarm it anyway? You don't know.
So what happened next? You mentioned that she contacted her parents. So how did it all unfold from there?
Yeah, well, the facts say that she did, quote, ring her father, and she was quite scared to move too much as well for fear of what might happen. She had sent texts before that explaining what the situation was. So naturally, that's just not a text or a phone call you're ever going to think you're going to get. Can't imagine then what Bill Pulver and Belinda Pulver are thinking at that particular time. The house, of course, then was just inundated. Like, police reporters, of course, are immediately dispatched to scenes like this, but all manner of emergency services pulling up, all not quite aware of exactly what's happening, because until you get there, until you assess the scene, you're not really sure. And I imagine reporters were getting as close as they could or were allowed to the scene anyway. Once they found out, it's hard to prevent that from happening, as you can imagine.
What are the kinds of services that assist in situations like this where there is a bomb threat? Do you just send everyone, bomb squad, federal officers?
Bomb squad, they send negotiators, they send psychiatrists, they would possibly even have profilers. Police response to something like this is just all-encompassing. And a young police officer called Karen Loudon, she spent 3 hours with Maddie, not knowing whether what was attached to her could have killed her, that could have gone off at any time. She actually got a bravery award for what she did. She stayed there with Maddie, which you could imagine would have been absolutely terrifying.
Do we know much about what was said between Madeleine and the officer? Did you get a chance to interview her?
No, I haven't, but I do know they just spent a lot of time talking about her HSC, her studies, what she maybe wanted to do in life, just generally like that, trying to keep her very, very calm. You can imagine very brave of that officer to be in that situation when she didn't really have to. They weren't giving very much information out at all. All we knew is there had been some sort of hostage situation, and this had been going on for hours and hours. And there wasn't a lot of information coming. And I do remember at about 7 o'clock, I rang a very, very senior police officer who I'd known for a long, long time. And I said, look, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. There's a hostage there. And he said, we've never dealt with a collar bomb. And I said, what? He said, we've never dealt with a collar bomb. And I said, what do you mean? And he explained. He said, there is a device around her neck. And we then quickly, it was in the early days of the internet, or, we weren't as internet savvy as we are now, but we did put it on the internet and said collar bomb, and it went viral. It went around the world, and it topped internet hits overseas in the American, on what's called the Drudge Report, which no Australian news story had ever done. It took us to a new level of audience engagement the Telegraph had never seen, ever. It went from a police operation where a teenager was being held on Sydney's North Shore to a worldwide story that broke across the world with those words, collar bomb.
So Madeleine had that collar bomb around her neck for, 10 hours. Do you know what kind of checks and tests were done in that time to kind of determine that it was a hoax?
They had bomb experts that was trying to get as close as they could without perhaps having it, detonated. They had no idea what sort of device. I think eventually they were able to X-ray it, and then it took a long time before they deemed it to be non-explosive. But, 10 hours. That's why it took so long, because, again, the officer I spoke to, when he told me, he said, we've never encountered this. We've had to talk to experts around the world, and they were still trying to figure out how dangerous the device was right up until, I think, those 10 hours.
There was a British Army expert in the end was talking authorities through it, so it became a most dramatic scene at that point. So the device was being continually assessed. There were also officers right at her side. There were shifts of police obviously close to her. So it's quite an extraordinary scene, and even people in the job thinking, okay, she thinks it's a device that could go off at any time, but this is our job, we've got to try and keep her calm. That's the first thing, and talk her through it.
Do we know how that ended up being resolved? Because I can only imagine Maddie's sense of relief when, someone would have come up to her and said, we're going to take it off, you're okay.
Yeah, I believe that the officers went in there and she just kind of collapsed because she'd been so tense. I think she'd been able to drink some water, but the finer details, the police were very careful to try and keep her feelings and her reactions private. They very much saw her as this victim and were very, very, very protective of her. Her father was very protective. I spent a bit of time with him, and I remember after the court case, the relief that Maddie's father expressed to the officers and to myself, it was quite amazing. And he was so thankful that the police had kept his daughter's privacy at a premium.
And of course, in such procedures as when the bomb squad is called, what they actually do and how they go about things is not often readily raised in court, because such procedures aren't necessarily meant to be known, in regards to any future people that think they could get away with something like this and think, oh, well, this is what they do, I heard this on the news, so they don't relay everything in court, but they give you enough information to say this person was here and this is how we tried to sort of assess the situation.
It's probably worth mentioning at this point that as a court reporter, you pick up the story once there's charges and once someone goes to court. But you and I, to break the fourth wall a little bit, we were both reporters at the same time, at the same publication, same radio station. And I remember when this story broke in its first instance, when it was still a police incident. Do you remember that afternoon when the news broke and how you felt about it? Because I remember thinking, I have never heard of something like this happening.
Oh, I couldn't believe it, really. I mean, when I say I couldn't believe it, I mean, it's out there, a police dispatch. I can't remember even what the media release actually said, because obviously at that point, police media are thinking, well, how much do we say? We've got to keep the reporters, who really at that point are just members of the public, away from the scene for their own safety, apart from anything else. And we don't want sort of shards of information coming out that might not be helpful. I don't know, neighbours saying something about something, because once it's cordoned off, the police have got to go, we've got to go in there and do what we do. I can't exactly remember what I was doing that day, but I was trying to put it together in my head, thinking, this is incredible. And I'm thinking the police reporter will be there, and if and when anyone gets charged, I was thinking, I just wonder how it's then going to go, through the courts. And I guess at some point I'll be involved in reporting on it, because once it gets to court, the court reporters normally sort of take care of the story from that point on. because police-related matters, unfortunately, seem to keep happening every other day. So the police reporter would then go on to another case, the next day.
And you would pick up the story from there. And I guess a collar bomb, or a story involving a collar bomb, I mean, you've done thousands of court cases over your career. That wouldn't be a common scenario that you would face.
Never. No, I've never had anything like that. No, and hopefully there never will be anything like that happen again, but nothing like that. And it was the psychological nature of it rather than the graphic nature that made this case so extraordinary. The terror is just as bad, the effect is just as bad, but it wasn't graphic in terms of physicality, thankfully. But you could just imagine the psychological effect of 10 hours it took in the end to determine that it was, in fact, just a gun safe, a portable gun safe. Okay, she's unharmed physically, but the mental effect of that. This case is something that's indelibly stamped on society, I think, let alone the victim. We all talk about how we thought about it, but we think of Madeleine Pulver and how it affected her. So, I just couldn't believe it. And then, obviously, once he's charged, the facts start slowly coming out about his background and the question of why, and all that. And the fascination keeps growing.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with crime editor Mark Morey and former court reporter Gil Taylor about the collar bomb hoax that brought Mosman to a standstill in 2011. So the culprit, and you mentioned the name before, Paul Douglas Peters, he fled the scene after attaching the fake bomb, to Madeleine's neck. When did police catch up with him?
Well, it was 5 days later when he went to the US, so it was almost immediate that he fled, and police got onto him pretty quickly. He was a wealthy businessman but had suddenly gone into some sort of financial strife, as was reported. We don't know how much that was. He had alcohol issues, he'd broken up with his wife, there was depression, there was all sorts of things. And his plan is the subject of debate because it was even thought he might have had the wrong house. Someone suggested that he had targeted a neighbour of theirs because he had money in a trust, a $12 million trust that he needed to access. That wasn't actually established, I don't think, but that was one of the possibilities raised during his sentence hearing and other court appearances. In the event, he left an email address for contact, which Bill Pulver tried a couple of times that afternoon and got nothing. But the sign-off, bizarrely, was the same name as a character in the novel Taipan, the James Clavell novel of 1966, which in itself is quite macabre, And the plan began unravelling when they traced the account to an address in Avoca where it had been accessed, and CCT of the building depicted a man in clothing that Madeleine had described, similar to the clothing she described. And his car was also in shot. I think it was a gold Range Rover. So obviously police could check the plates from that. So it began to unravel pretty quickly, and they traced the account through to Chicago. And he was eventually arrested in Kentucky only a couple of weeks later by the FBI.
And he didn't actually have any connection to the Pulvers, did he?
He told psychiatrists, at least, he'd never met them. So the why has remained not completely a mystery, as greed was mentioned as one motive. I remember the judge saying this, Judge Peter Zara, District Court judge. But the real why has never really been exactly pinned down, which is one of the frustrating things for the family, even though the case is long resolved and he did his time and etc. There's still this weight of, but why us? Why did you do this to us? Like, you can't fathom why it happened and why we were chosen. And were they chosen? We still don't specifically know, because he didn't give evidence at the sentence hearing. And that, again, was one of the frustrating things for the victims when the perpetrator doesn't give evidence. It is their right, of course. You can't make them give evidence, but they just want to hear him say it. And that's an important thing as well. He did apologise at the parole hearing, sort of latently, but I don't know what weight that had for the Pulvers at that particular point. That would be something that they would have to speak about. But, yeah, the actual why has never come out. His ex-wife even said, quote, "I don't think Paul knows why he did it." And apparently she didn't even ask him, which seems sort of interesting that you wouldn't, why did you do that?
Yeah.
But that's what came out in the sentence hearing as well.
Let's delve into his defence in court, because you were following the case, you were in the court. What was the psychiatrist's testimony during that time? Because that was an interesting kind of thing to come out of the court case.
Yeah, Dr. Westmore was giving evidence. Psychiatrists seemed to be split over his mental issues. He didn't formally rely on mental illness, but mental issues were raised to sort of, that can act as a mitigating component for any sentence that's going to come, such as the alcohol dependency, the breakup of his wife. And Dr. Westmore was saying that he'd completely withdrawn. He told psychiatrists that he was acting out some sort of character in a science fiction novel he was writing, which could be similar to perhaps that character that was in the James Clavell novel, Taipan. The judge didn't quite buy that, but that was some of the defences raised at the sentence hearing, because by then he pleaded guilty after initially denying any involvement. But once the addresses were traced, they said, bank records show you bought the balaclava and the baseball bat. You admit to being in the street at the time, and then you say you can't remember anything. I'm up the steps towards their house. The next thing I remember, I'm in Avoca. So police obviously, we're going to charge you with this. So, and he eventually pleaded guilty to the sentence hearing, fortunately avoiding a lengthy trial. That's at least something, because victims of crime that then have to go to a trial and give evidence, if they're called to give evidence, that's quite harrowing and unnecessary when they've obviously committed this crime. But of course, it's his right if he pleads not guilty, but he pleaded guilty in this case. So,
did that help him at all in sentencing or in the verdict by cutting the trial short?
Well, it always does. Judges will usually almost certainly refer to a plea of guilty, even if it's not at the earliest possible opportunity. If it is at the earliest possible opportunity, the greater the weight it has. The later you plead, the less weight. If you don't plead guilty at all and go to trial and are found guilty, and at your sentence hearing maintain your innocence, that doesn't work well, because a jury or whatever, not in this case, but a jury has decided, or judge alone has decided, that you are in fact guilty. If you keep maintaining your innocence, that doesn't help mitigate the sentence at all, and judges will obviously mention that in the judgment. So it would have given some weight to plead guilty in this case, even after the extraordinary weight of evidence was against him.
Do you remember that sentencing day and when he found out how long he was going to go to prison? Do you remember what he was like or what happened that day?
Yeah, well, he was very emotional at the sentence hearing, but only when his wife was talking about him. But most of the time, Peters was fairly expressionless. It's sort of been my experience, without judging people or trying to judge who's guilty or not, when they're completely expressionless, it sort of gives off an air of, well, I know what's coming. I'm not going to be shocked by what I'm going to get. I guess counsel sometimes will say, look, you've got to prepare yourself for the possibility of getting X. So I don't think he would have been terribly shocked. The Pulvers, they were all in tears. I think there's a torrent and a gamut of emotions that are sort of released in court often. For reporters, you get very nervous and tense before a verdict. Firstly, when you hear there's a verdict, you rush there, and for some reason you're very nervous and tense about it. And you're thinking, hang on, I'm not in the dock and I'm not the victim's family, but you just feel it. You feel something and you think, what is Judge Zara going to say? What's he going to get?
What did he get?
He got a maximum 13 and a half years and a minimum of 10, which it's hard to sort of pin a sentence down and say, is it too much or not enough? Especially something like that, because I don't think I'd ever experienced a case like that before. So I was thinking, well, what's the guidepost for this sort of thing? So the best thing to do is to listen to the judgment that the judge has written, which is incredibly hard work, weeks of trying to balance all the elements of the case to make sure that justice is done that there are aggravating and mitigating circumstances to the case.
Was there anything in that judgment that stood out to you?
Just what was that one phrase that Judge Zara used, unimaginable terror that she experienced. And of course, the usual comments in the sanctity of her own home, like whenever a crime is committed in someone's home, especially in that situation, the entitlement to feel that you're completely safe. So judges they always mention that when a crime is committed in the sanctity of someone's private home. That's always a lot worse. But unimaginable terror was a good phrase to use, and it sort of hits home, and we're all sitting there going, well, that's something that'll be going in what I say about the case in the next bulletin or whatever it is. You tend to sit there and wait for a very eloquent summary, and it can sometimes be in one line from the judge, and you go, that's what I'm going to use.
Madeleine gave a impromptu press conference outside court once that sentence was handed down, and it was kind of the first time we really got to hear from her. Do you remember what she said?
Oh, just how relieved she was and how terrified she was. And she said that she's still going to go to university, and she said that she's going to pursue her life. And it was very calm and quite eloquent, really, for someone who had gone through something like this.
And who was so young at the time as well. She was still a teenager.
Still a teenager. And certainly what Bill Pulver said about, her poise and dignity, I think that was a good way to describe it, actually, better than anyone could.
I realise it is going to take quite some time to come to terms with what happened, but today was important because now the legal process is over. For me, it was never about the sentencing, but to know that he will not reoffend. It was good to hear the judge acknowledge the trauma he's put my family and me through. One of the reasons I wanted to come today was out of respect for all those involved, in particular the New South Wales Police Force, the DPP, and all the support we have received. We are extremely grateful for the professional manner in which this case has been handled. Looking forward, I'm heading to Sydney University next year and really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
I do want to ask you, while I have the opportunity to have you in the chair, what it's like being in a courtroom for those that haven't been there or been a victim of crime, once again, touch wood, being a victim or a victim's family, sitting in a courtroom and watching the person who potentially either did something horrible to you or your family member or murdered a family member. What have you taken away from watching that happen? Because whenever I've been in court and watched the families, that's something that's always stayed with me.
Yeah, and even, the families, sometimes even seeing the person in the dock can trigger things and can result in certain fracas in the courtroom, which you can understand. Of course, then the judge will always intervene and demand silence because it's the only way you can then restore civility. But a lot of the time, they're very emotionally affected. You see them sort of, and after verdicts and things like that, there's some fierce hugging and there's tears and things like that. Sometimes there's stony-faced sort of just, it's over, I'm relieved, all I want to do is get out of here,
Yeah, because it can be really overwhelming sitting in a courtroom.
Yeah, it is. It can be for them, and I always sort of made a point of not sitting anywhere near either the victim's family or the accused's or perpetrator's family. Even like the perpetrator's families, completely destroyed because of the actions of their loved one. That's something that sometimes gets overlooked too, and they, there's a sort of a perception that they're sort of the enemy or something, but they're just there going, well, we have to support this person no matter what they've done, and that would be very difficult. But for the victims of crime, there's just layers of effect that they're dealing with.
And they often sit across the aisle or even behind the perpetrator's family.
Yes, it's probably a good idea to have people on opposite sides. I guess, I've only ever seen maybe two outbreaks of violence in court, but most of the time that won't happen. Victims of crime, a lot of them have never been in a courtroom before, and that's their only experience of court. So it's just horrifying, for them. Yeah, it can be just an awful experience.
It's also particularly hard when, you get that sentence, and in this case it's like, great, he's going to prison, I don't have to think about it again. And then Peters tries to appeal.
Yeah, this is always the difficult part of it. It's everyone's right to appeal. A lot of the times the appeal is doomed to fail. On some occasions there's some chance of it succeeding, and some of them do succeed, even overturned. You see decisions overturned. He did appeal. In 2013, the appeal got well underway against the severity of the sentence. One of the things they raised was that the device wasn't real. It was a hoax, it was a fake collar bomb, and also the mental stresses that I was experiencing at the time. Well, Judge Zara didn't accept the mental side of it, the actual, well, not a defect of the mind. He wasn't relying solely on actual mental illness. So one of the appeal grounds was he didn't take it into account. But of course, in the judgment, he dismissed it pretty much completely. So the Court of Criminal Appeal agreed with that anyway, and it's always a bench of 3 judges. So once again, the mental illness ground or the mental issues ground was rejected. They felt that he did do it for some form of gain, financial, even without nominating an amount. I can even quote the judgment that was given from the Court of Criminal Appeal. The absence of a real explosive did not reduce the gravity of the offence, which means the terror was real, the belief was real, so actually for the victim it didn't make any difference anyway. So the Court of Criminal Appeal feeling that the offence was as bad as if there was an explosive. Similar to someone who might be talking online to someone who they think is a child or something like that inappropriately when it's really a police officer. Some people might say, oh, but it wasn't, a child, but you thought it was, and you pursued a crime. You pursued something to do that is completely heinous.
So Paul was released from prison in September 2021. But before being released, he apologised, which is what you touched on a bit earlier. What did he say?
Well, yeah, the parole hearing, and you're not really meant to make speeches at your parole hearing. You're not even meant to speak unless you're addressed. And he's just started talking. I don't think anyone had said anything at that point. And he said, there's something I'd like to say if you don't mind. And Judge Marion reminded him that, well, you've got counsel to speak on your behalf, so I just want to remind you of that. And he said, it was just going to be something like, in not so many words, a heartfelt apology, that's all. So that's a matter for the Pulvers as whether that's really an adequate apology or not at a parole hearing where the State Parole Authority had, certainly at the end of that hearing, ruled their intention to grant parole.
We did hear from the Pulvers during that process as well. Bill Pulver gave a statement to the State Parole Authority. Is that a normal thing to do? Does the family get a right to kind of have their say in that process?
Yeah, family members can make submissions, but family members can't, this is going to sound a little tough, but family members can't really require anything, which sounds a little, victims of crime may find that hard to sort of grapple with, but victims' impact statements is usually what's taken into account in sentencing and things like that. Any judge can take into account anything that's submitted, and the judge will decide what is adequate and what isn't. Even some victims' impact statements from victims of crime have been deemed not appropriate because of the wording in them or things like that. So, which wouldn't be easy for a judge to do, but it's something that needs to occur.
What do we know about Peter's parole conditions? Whenever you get out of prison, there are things that you are allowed to do or not allowed to do that do involve the victim and the victim's family.
Yes, well, naturally you can't go anywhere near Mosman. I think Avoca was mentioned, and there was another country area where I think the Pulvers might have a property that he wasn't allowed to go near either. So certain sections of the state he is banned from. Alcohol was raised, that he has to get on top of his alcohol issues. They usually outline programs that you have to complete while on parole. A parole officer is usually assigned to you, and there's conditions such as if they call on you, you might have to be in a certain place at a certain time. I don't believe he's being monitored specifically electronically, But sometimes those conditions are attached. He'll be monitored to certain degrees depending on the level of risk of reoffending that they think he might be under. Because he's deemed a low risk of reoffending, it might not be as tight as some prisoners on release, but all those conditions would apply, certainly. And if he was to breach any one of those, he'd be automatically very likely to be sent back to jail to complete the term. And, of course, you can keep people past maximum terms in some cases. If they are deemed a danger to the community, you can keep them in past parole period or set sentence time, which is is controversial the right word? I mean, it depends on the nature of the prisoner, doesn't it, really? If they haven't followed any of the programs, if they don't look like there's any capacity not to reoffend, that's when the state can then apply, and it's another court hearing, to keep someone in prison based on those submissions.
What about Madeleine? So obviously she was a teenager when this happened in 2011. Many years have passed. What do we know about her life?
Yes, well, from last report, she was an interior designer. I think it was described by someone as her dream job. I imagine that would have been her, somewhere in the eastern suburbs, I think. She's working and recently married, and it's just so ironic, that we're talking about it in a way, because she always, I think one of the comments was, I look forward to the day where my name isn't related to his. But of course, this case has been such a fascination, a morbid fascination in a way, but people are interested in the outcomes and how people are going, post the case and things, and it's great that it's turned out so well for her. It doesn't happen for everybody, but for her, she seems to have maintained that stoic sort of ability to also put it to one side and move on, I guess because she had so much of her life to live. That's the thing. I think she was only 18 even after the sort of aftermath of the case and everything. So much yet to achieve and go through and experience, and it's certainly a great shame, that she had to experience something like that at such a young age.
I was trying to work out when I was thinking about this case, like what the lesson is for us as a society. Can we change anything to make sure it doesn't happen again? But every time I thought about that, it just seems like this case is just so on its own. Like when you talk about like a murder charge or like a kidnapping, it can be like we can change things in society to make sure that to the best of our ability that doesn't happen. But this one just feels so isolated because it's so unusual.
Yeah, that was one of the things Bill Pulver said, I remember too now. He thanked the judge implicitly and said, to me, it seems like he's given him a sentence that would make sure that that doesn't happen again. But I guess generally heavier sentences aren't going to eliminate certain crimes, not even necessarily lower their frequency, which a lot of people tend to think that it would. But it depends on the offender at the time. And I guess it's through Parliament and legislation that judges are bound by all those decisions that they have to make in sentencing. It's all along parliamentary guidelines. So it's all a matter of coming before Parliament and looking at laws and how they should change or could change depending on what society feels it needs. In this case, as you say, it's very difficult unless you got really right into the mind of Paul Peters. I guess in the end he was deemed low risk of reoffending, which is a good outcome for what occurred while he was in prison. That's really the best you can do. The best you can hope for is that people are rehabilitated to the point where they are genuinely remorseful for what they did. In this case, I think Bill Pulver was saying, I don't really believe he has genuinely shown it, apart from the guilty plea and, the parole authority sort of comment. You'd have to be inside his mind, and the psychiatrists, it was interesting how they said that he had completely withdrawn after his marriage breakdown and the alcohol and everything else. Probably a dangerous position for anyone to be in, I think. Doesn't excuse anything, as defence or a number of people always say, that just gives us a reason why it happened. Doesn't mean it should have happened, and it shouldn't have, absolutely shouldn't have. But it gives you, and you need that reason to then go, okay, now we know why they did it. The next person that might give us a bit more leverage in understanding why they're doing these things. And once you understand that, you can try to sort of seep an antidote into it, if that's possible. And I don't know, I'm not an expert on those things, so I'm not sure how you do that. But yeah, crime is something that sadly is always going to be with us. And it's just a matter of community consultation. That's another good thing, to represent what the community thinks justice is and what it should be. But I still think that certainly Australia, certainly the Westminster system for courts is, unless someone can show me a better model, it's definitely the way to go. You know, I think it's much better than the situation in the US, where the prosecution can do a daily news conference and basically say whatever, and the defence too. It's just bizarre, the information that gets out while a trial is still running. You really have to concentrate on facts and all those sorts of things, and the sanctity of the court has to be maintained and protected.
Thanks to today's guests for assisting us to tell this story. Gil Taylor retired from his career as a court reporter earlier this year after over a decade on the beat. In that time, he covered hundreds, if not thousands, of court cases for 2GB Radio in Sydney. Mark Morey started his career as a cadet reporter on the Daily Mirror in 1980, working on crime. He's gone on to win the Kennedy Award for Scoop of the Year in 2014 and has also been nominated for a Walkley Award. He's currently working as crime editor for the Daily Telegraph. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Bath, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you've been enjoying our recent episodes, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favourite podcast app. It helps other people find our episodes and helps us understand what you love about the show. This podcast was made by Mamma Mia, the only women's media company in Australia. If you want to support women's media, we'd love it if you became a Mamma Mia subscriber. There's a link in the show notes.